join things by fiber, by twisted fibers, by string. So glue, there is archaeological evidence for glue well into the human, into the Paleolithic. There are two types of glue. There's bitumen, which is a naturally occurring, naturally occurs in some places, and there's pitch, which is actually made from birch bark and is an extremely complex technology. It's not something that just pours out of the trees. It's very complex to get. But even if you have bitumen or pitch, even then, you still have to twist and bind fibers into that to make it really secure. And so string is absolutely at the beginning of human technology, because the minute you join one thing to another, so you can have a stone tool, but you can only have a stone tool, or you can have a piece of wood, but you can only have a piece of wood. But by joining these two things together, that is an enormous conceptual leap in terms of human cognitive function as well as technology, and string is at the essence of that. A piece of string on its own is quite useless. It's what you can do with it that's so important. So the concept of joining one thing to another to make a third object is a very, very complex indeed, and required huge technological and conceptual shifts. As well as being used to join things together, fibers can be manipulated into making objects themselves. These include hunting, in terms of the human past. These include hunting nets, bags for carrying, animal traps, and so on. And all of these are extremely important technologies in their own right. For example, in order to be able to carry seeds or shells or whatever, you need something to carry them in, and twisted fiber bags were probably some of these the very earliest pieces of carrying equipment. So today we're going to be talking about string made from plant materials, but of course long fibers or string can also be made from animal produce. And I'm just putting this slide up just so that you know that we're aware, and also that you're aware that there are many types of different materials that can be used to make fiber, both from animals and from plants. In the deep human evolutionary time, there is no evidence of animal origin string way back in the Paleolithic, but it's probably because it just didn't survive. Whereas there is evidence, the earliest evidence for twisted fibers or string is from plants. But that doesn't mean to say that it wasn't used, that animal origin fibers were not used. I'm sure they were, but we have no actual evidence for that. So to make string, whether it's with animal or plant materials, you have to twist fibers together and add pieces in. Basically, that's it's simplified into the most basic. And then once you learn how to make that technique, you can extend it to unlimited lengths. Papua New Guinea is one of the few places left in the world where current and recent manufacture and use of traditional string has continued. Much of the evidence for the most simple, and by simple I do not mean easy, it is in fact an incredibly complex procedure and technology. But one of the most straightforward ways of manufacturing string from plant materials is known particularly from Papua New Guinea. As well as all the other uses they have for string, they have a cultural tradition on making these string bags known as bilums. And so fiber technology, or the art of making string, is quite well known and has been quite well recorded and studied. We don't have time to go into the complexities today of raw materials, that is the fiber preparation, and I know Caroline will talk about some of the local materials that have been used in the past year. But depending on the types of fiber used, it can be a very time-consuming and lengthy process to prepare your materials before you even start twisting them. The fibers need to be separated and broken down, and depending on the materials, this can take weeks. Retting can be done by submerging the material in water, and this allows bacteria to dissolve or rot away the cellular tissues. And that is only the first part. It's enough to say for now that preparing the fibers to work with is on its own very complex, very long-winded, and requires a detailed understanding of the materials. Then you have to turn the prepared fibers into string. Before spindles and wools, which are only known from the Neolithic onwards, which in my context and in human evolutionary terms is just yesterday, twisting fiber was done by rolling. Here you can see it being rolled on the leg, and this is a photo from Papua New Guinea. And all of this just gives you a ball of string. Then you have to use this to make your useful items. And this is all very, very time consuming indeed. And while it may not be universal and may have been different in the past, and there's no really way of us being able to find that out in terms of the Paleolithic use of string, we can't be sure, but much of the string making and working with fibres in modern tribal or traditional cultures without access to purchased string has been done primarily by women. Imagine a world where everything you need, from food to clothes to tools to shelter, have to be made. You have to collect the raw materials, then prepare them, then make your useful items. This graph shows you how much time was used within that context, simply manufacturing string. Again, this is from Papua New Guinea. So that the whole circle is all the manufacturing of items in Papua New Guinea, and that almost semicircle of green is only string making. So that just gives you some idea of how incredibly long-winded and time-consuming manufacturing and using string is. In fact, much of the string was then passed to men, and string is incorporated in most of their objects also in Papua New Guinea. Natural string does not last long and also needs to be frequently replaced. In fact, women, if it was women, became early on in human evolution slaves to twisted fibre technology. Think about women in history. Making or working with string or fibre has been the lot of women right through history as well. Think the medieval high-class women who passed their time making embroidery, to the working-class women knitting constantly here and elsewhere as they went about their daily business. This absolute control of string and fibre making that it had on people's lives really only ceased in the 20th century. What the long-term evolutionary impact had on women, we don't know, because it's never been studied. And it's a very difficult thing to study, because I've tried, and we still haven't yet quite managed to work out how to do it. So now I'm just going to look at what are the earliest pieces of evidence for string. So the earliest evidence for string is really indirect. That is, items that appear in the archaeological record or behaviour that appears in the archaeological record that cannot have happened without string. So you can't really make a seaworthy craft without binding material. Even this simple raft on the left is made of tree trunks bound together with fibres. Seagoing craft, even dugout canoes, needed outriggers to keep them stable in the sea. These are simpler to make than a keel. The earliest evidence for seagoing craft is not absolutely clear. Evidence for humans on some islands that have never been joined to continents, such as Flores in Indonesia, dates to around 1 million years ago. Crete also has evidence for humans from around 130,000 years ago, while Australia is known to have been occupied from at least 65,000 years ago. And none of these places could have been walked to even when the sea level was completely different. The second way to demonstrate early use of string is in jewellery, such as these perforated beads, because they had to be tied or hung to be used. The earliest tentative evidence for this is also around 1 million years old, with more definitive evidence from Neanderthal sites around 125,000 years old. And by about 75,000 years ago, they became common. Now, these time periods are all well deep into the Paleolithic. So really a very long time ago indeed. If you imagine that farming appeared around 5,000 or 6,000 years ago in Scotland, just to provide a sort of context. The very earliest fragment of twisted fibre is from a Neanderthal site in France. This fibre, this is a scanning electron micrograph of the fibre, and it's around 45,000 years old. This fragment of fibre was found under a stone tool that had not been moved or disturbed since it was laid down, and it demonstrates 3-ply cordage using inner bark fibre and double SZ twisting. What is inner bark? So the inner bark of trees is also known as bast fibre, and this is the material that's almost always found to have been used before the Neolithic. The next indirect piece of evidence we have comes from the Upper Paleolithic, around 35,000 years ago. These are bone needles that have perforations in them, so we know that they were used for sewing of some sort. And also on the right, this is a Venus figurine from the Gravettian culture, which is about 35,000 years old. And if you look down on the right-hand side, it looks like she's wearing some kind of a fiber skirt of some sort. And that has been interpreted to represent twisted fiber or even weaving. And if weaving was in use 35,000 years ago, that means that twisted fibers must have been in use or developed. This technology must have developed over a huge long time period, because these technologies are extremely complex. When we get down to the Mesolithic, which is when we have evidence of people in Scotland just before the Mesolithic, twisted fibers and textiles become much more common. Knotted and knotless netting methods are known, mostly from Mesolithic remains. Many Mesolithic sites in Northern Europe and Russia have evidence of string from the Mesolithic. None of these occur in Scotland so far, but there's one site called Boldner Cliff in the English Channel, where a piece of twisted fibre string that is 8,000 years ago, made from honeysuckle and either nettle or wild clematis, was discovered by Gary Momber from Southampton. It survived because it was underwater. In general, plants rarely survive for such long periods. Their use is less well known in a human early prehistory because plant materials survive less well than animal bones and stone tools. And it is for this reason that the past has been reconstructed to imagine people chasing animals around with spears, etc. While this, of course, happened, the use of plants as food and here as technology was probably just as important, or even more so, than animal produce. String was an integral part of human life for as long as we have been humans. And now I'm going to hand over to Caroline so that she can talk in more local terms about the materials and the evidence that there is for more recent use of twisting fibers and twisted fibers in and around here.
Thanks very much, Karen. Can I just remind people to have their microphones switched off, because there was some funny noises. Make sure. That's great. Karen was just talking about bast fibres, so I thought you might like to see what these look like. This is lime bast that I made rope. I don't normally work with this material because it doesn't exist where I live, but somebody gave me some and it was actually very nice to work with and very strong. So I'm coming at the string from the other end, as it were, from the perspective of working with the natural materials that are around me, working with the practical technique, understanding the different types of techniques and what plants different ways you can make string with the plants that you have, but also kind of going back and finding what traditions were used fairly recently and further back. So this is the landscape around me. This is what you would see typically, and basically ropes were made from all the plants that you can see in the picture. So a while ago I did a project where I made 100 ropes, a different rope each day, and I started with making the ropes from plants that I knew people used to use, and I've got, started to notice more and more different plants and used different materials. But basically the common materials that people on Skye, this is North Skye. On the left, you've got heather rope. In front of that, the white one, that's purple moorgrass. On the right, there's birch, and then in the front, there's rush, soft rush, hair moss behind, and that's purple moorgrass again. So those are the most common materials, but there's a whole pile of other materials. So heather was used a lot. It's very strong, it's very long lasting, and it's really good. It was a common sight to see on crofts, 100 years ago, you'd see coils of heather rope waiting to be used for many jobs. In Gaelic, it's called Seomhan Fruch. So it was used for roof construction, all sorts of things. And basically it was gathered in the winter, you needed to pull it. So it's about this time of year, September, when the sap has risen. And if it's growing on a slope, you kind of rustle around in the undergrowth and you get you don't want the fluffy bit at the top, but you get these lovely thin roots. So you, again, like Karen was talking about, the labor in getting your materials. That's a big aspect. So you've got to, gather the heather and then you sit and make it. And basically it was sit around all winter and they would make it all winter. And then it was put outside at the back of the house when you had a big long coil, and the men would pee on it. And their urine was very good with ammonia, and ammonia is a preservative. And so that was sort of helping to make it last even longer. Just like when they're walking the tweed was soaked in urine. I was teaching one workshop, and we had this discussion about women and men's pee, and we realized that men's pee was actually stronger and had more ammonia and was actually much better for the job, because men had a better diet. They had much more protein in their diet than the women. So I thought that was interesting. So it looks like heather rope to me because of the dark color, but this is how it was used on the houses outside to hold the thatch down. And I've worked out that that's about 450 meters of rope. And it's a communal job because you've got to throw the rope over and attach it down. So it just shows the labor involved. But I've actually seen a house in North Uist that was the gable to gable on the inside. It was a stone house with stone gables. There was heather rope running, and there's very little wood there. And the heather rope was used to support the turfs, which then supported the thatch. So this is a sample of heather rope. There was another old house which had fallen in, and the thatch had fallen in, and there was 3 different sorts of rope made from different materials. And this is heather rope from that house. And it makes you realise that linking back to Skara Brae, which is 5,000 years old, there's a rope fragment found in a very similar situation where they think it was twisted heather and it was in the thatch and was in the midden, which had collapsed. So these are quotes from a few books. So some of the research, different ways that you go about research, you just find little snippets here and there. And sometimes things link up, sometimes things are questionable. But basically, lots of people talk about heather for thatch. And here he's talking about small poaching nets have been quite recently made of the same material, surely a most tedious and difficult task. Another thing was the seaweed. Seaweed was cut. And the thing about heather rope is that it floats in the sea. So it was laid out, and then the seaweed and you pull it in, again, a communal thing for working. I did a workshop I'll talk about that. I did a workshop not too long ago, a few years ago in Stornoway, and I was gathering rope stories from people. And one guy came up to me and said he remembered when he was a boy seeing the boats from the outer lying villages in the harbour in Portree in Stornoway, and he could tell which ones they were because they had ropes of heather which were floated and the other ropes were sinking. So that's not that long ago, and I thought that was quite interesting. So the other thing is your materials, and you can see here from this quote that it wasn't always that easy to get materials. You're really dependent on your rushes and your thatch, and then as soon as this sort of hunting, shooting thing started, the landlords, I'll just leave it at that. Okay. So purple moorgrass. This is Britain's only deciduous grass. You'll recognize it because on the hillside in winter, it's the white grass that catches on those metal fences when the wind blows, and you see it, these lovely white curls on the heather. So this is, and that's why it's a good, it doesn't decay. It's got a lot of silica in it, and you'll see it lying in the bog and it still doesn't decay. So I've known about this quote from Thomas Pennant's Journey to Skye in 1772 for quite a while, and that I've heard that he that fishermen on Skye made nets of this grass. And I didn't really know if I could trust this source. It's really interesting, but you just don't know if you can trust it in terms of the actual plant material. But having got hold of the actual book, the frontispiece talks about traveling with Reverend John Lightfoot, who was a botanist and who later went on to publish a botany book. And so I felt I could trust the plant material. He also talks about the pun glass of the Highlanders, and I wondered what that was. And then I found another quote, which it's the old Gaelic word for purple moor grass, because the new Gaelic word is fianach. As you saw earlier, I had the Gaelic and the Latin. So this is a house with grass ropes, so it could be purple moor grass, or it could be marram, or it could be rush. So there's also lots of evidence from Ireland, people talking about it was good because it didn't rot, and it was used for making ropes, for thatching. So muran is another term, you come across it quite a lot, but there's a sort of problem because, or bent, the Gaelic word muran refers to two different species, marram grass and a bent grass, which is one of the softer agrostis type, I think. So it's, you don't really know what material they're talking about when you read old things and they mention muran. So on the right, we've got, this is marram grass he's using. I can just tell by the shape of the leaves there, I think. So anyway, they used to make a lot of marram grass, and then this was just woven as a plaid. So we're under the horses and ponies. It was used for mats and wall dividers, chair seats. And I've got a quote from Highland Folkways by I.F. Grant. In the islands, the frames of chairs were largely made of driftwood and the seats of interwoven cords of bent grass. So another way of doing research is you linking up different things. So on the left, we've got Beveridge's photo of this basket. In the middle is the image. It's in the National Museum of Scotland. And that's it. And on the right is Dwelly from Dwelly. So those of you who don't know, Dwelly's it's illustrated Gaelic dictionary. So you need to know the Gaelic word, but then once you know the Gaelic word, it gives you a very good description. So for instance, Dwelly's description for the word sek, which is kind of like sack. It's a bag of 8 pecks holding grain or meal, made wholly of reeds or shioman lucha. A rope was wove through the handles when full and the mouth brought close together. It was like a 2-bowl bag of meal in shape, and it was from Lewis. So that's really specific. And shioman lucha means rush rope. Shioman is the Gaelic for rope. So we've got these other words, plata heel and plata vulin. Now those words aren't in Dwelly, but they are from North Europe. Well, the Monarch Isles is where this basket comes from. And it was used for holding flour, and the flour or the meal, taking it to the grain, to the mill and back. So that's maybe where the name comes from. And so those are names that are still in the island. Yeah. So we've got soft rush is also a very, very valuable crop. not quite as strong. You pull it and you can gather it any time, and it's used for lots of things. It was also used for rush lights. Locally where I stay, my neighbours used to, they remember when there was a patch of land that they grew rushes, and they looked after it and they harvested them together, and they used them because it was a valuable crop used for thatching. Whereas now his son has to put weed killer, sprays it to stop it invading, because then the sheep hasn't got anything to eat. So that's changed quite quickly, just because the land management is different and we're using plants in different ways. So this is the other plants. Remember I showed you up above the heather. So this was the other two ropes from that same thatch. And I think it was just layers and layers of thatch put on, and each time maybe a different rope was used. So I mentioned earlier there's different ways of making rope. So I learned how to make heather rope first from somebody from Orkney, and I learned that about 20-30 years ago. And that's exactly the same process that's on the right, where you have that double twist, and you've bound the material, and it's really strong, and then you can ply that. Karen was talking about plied rope. The rope on the left is made in a very different way. It's more like spinning, and you just twist it, and you need two people, and you need a sort of tool that does it, and it twists, and it's not as strong. But often rope was made like that you needed something quite quickly, and you would twist a piece and use it. Like on Skye, people have talked to me when they're cutting the hay, you just pull out a bit of hay at the bottom, twist it, and you make a length of rope that can go over the stook. So that was done when they were young, in their childhood. So we've got examples here from this book that I've only just got, which is brilliant, and had lots of things in it of all sorts. So it's just showing you different ways that rope was used, like Karen was talking, and I'm using rope rather than string, but I suppose it's because it's slightly fatter. But so you've got the sheep collar, you've got sheep fetters made out of straw, that you've got a burden rope in the centre at the bottom, and on the right at the bottom you've got sand sedge. So that's a particular plant. I don't even know what sand sedge looks like. So burden ropes were, that would be a rope with a loop at one end, and you'd be able to carry a whole heap of hay or straw or whatever materials you were gathering, or there's lots of things. So there's lots of different ways you can. So thinking of different ways that you need to use ropes. So using rope or string as twining is one of the earliest methods. And it's basically a vertical element that's bound on both sides with string. So these are from Shetland. So Shetland doesn't have any trees or kind of hard materials to work with. So this technique has been developed to make sturdy baskets when you've only got soft materials. To make the basket on the left, it's called a Shetland kishie. You need 40 meters of your rush rope that we looked at earlier before you start the basket. So it just gives you a bit of an idea of the process and the preparation required. And then they're using the uprights there. I think they're cane, but once they're bound in, So this is images of that method of making rope that I was talking about. Oh yes, I've just been. So when I was talking about twining, I've got a note. Again, referencing Ozzy the Iceman, his outer cape was made of twined grass, and that's from 5,300 years ago. So I'd made a coat which was in an exhibition, and it was a teacher she was doing the class project, and then she told me that it was done in exactly the same way, and I didn't know that. I'd developed it from first principles. So that was very exciting for me. So we've got straw rope granary being made on the left. So this is from Ireland, and this is the simple twisting rope, a bit like spinning, but you can show, as with any rope, you can make with the same material, you can make a thin rope or a thin or really, really fine or thick, you know, you can, and then you can ply it up as well. So on the left, it's hay, and that big thick rope is going to be wrapped around, but the pile behind it, and then they build it up, and it's like a hay granary from Ireland. And it's called a Siagog, but I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. And on the right, you've got hay from 1936. That's like one of the quick ropes being made, and that might have been made for all sorts of reasons, all sorts of uses. So there are other materials. I think Karen mentioned nettle. Oh, okay. Nettle is on the left. And so, you know, that's quite a time-consuming process. I haven't got many nettles near me, but when I have been in places, I have, and it's really lovely. Once you work the fibres down, you get this, the top is like this really thin, delicate, lacy stuff. But, you know, there's just all different. The rope on the right is made from old sacking. So that, and I've heard of in Africa rope being made nowadays from plastic bags. So it's all different stuff. So you can see the rope where my hand is, that's plied. So that's 2 bits of, I've made some rope and then I've put 2 together, and I'll maybe speak about that in a moment. You've also got hard materials. So it's willow or hazel, normally referred to as withies when you do research, but that's a kind of general term and I tend to mistrust it. It was used for hobbling cattle. You'd make a quick binding for bind the front and the back foot together so the cattle couldn't go very far. In Lewis, it was like a good resource, and people used to have little gardens. So despite the wind and everything, they'd really try and grow their willows so that they could have to make creels. So on the right, we've got a hand twisted bit of rope for a cow or something, and that was from in Catalan, north of Spain. But I was just amazed that, you know, you need pretty strong hands to make that rope. So this is another problem with doing research. So this quote, so that it's well known that the cattle were swum over from Calray. So the top quote is from Thomas Pennant's book from 1774. And he says they were tied with ropes fastened from the horn of one to its tail and to the next. And then from a later book, 1811, John Pinkerton, where he shouldn't be changing the text, and he's just printing these interesting journeys. He's put tied with ropes made of twisted withies, fastened from the underjaw of the one to the tail of the preceding. So I don't know. And you just think, has he made that up? Was there an earlier version of the Thomas Pennant, or yeah, so you just never really know how things can be interpreted. I've read about bog fir for a while, and bog pine, and I never kind of really understood what it was, because the quote that I read from Highland Folkways, greater strength was needed for drawing the plough, and they were made from the twisted fibres of roots. I've seen small fragments. Hugh Miller described how he saw a man stripping a piece of moss fir into filaments with a pocket knife. The filaments were twisted into rope of great strength and flexibility for use as hawsers, the bulks of herring nets, and the lacings of sails. So you can think how strong that needs to be. So the problem that I had was moss fir is a little plant that does grow on the hills, but that wasn't what they're referring to. I think they're referring to this, which is the bog pine, which is what you find when you're digging up your peat. So that wood in itself is really old. And then it was split into little bits and lengths, thin lengths, which was then sewn into rope. And then on the not sewn, twisted. On the left, we've got 2 people. Now, what's happening is they're plying the rope. So they've done that first rope by just twisting, and they're holding the tension so that they're plying it. Once they've made it, it'll be fine. But that's really interesting, I think. Horsehair is another material that was used a lot. It's really slippery to work with, and I've managed to make rope, but it was very slippery, and I think you need a kind of tool to twist it. So it's quite interesting seeing this, that he's got the wooden tool, and it's more like spinning it, I think, But there's a quote from Highland Folkways again, which has always amused me. I was told that if a man who had a pony with a fine tail stabled it at an inn when he attended market or other diversions, he was apt to find all the hairs had been plucked out when he returned to fetch his beast. And that just shows you how valuable materials are. And then if you know what your materials are, and everybody's kind of keeping an eye open for those things. So this is a puffin snare with it's in Highland Folk Museum, I think. There is an example there, and it was basically 2 rocks either was bedded in onto the ground, and the puffins would just get caught in all these snares. So those snares are made out of horsehair. We don't know what the fibre for the central thing is. It could be leather or animal fibres. So there's still lots of other materials. So hair moss I haven't spoken about. I haven't found any evidence for it being used in the Highlands, but the Romans used it a lot. They were excavating for a wind farm south of Edinburgh, and they came across all this material across a bog, and it was hair moss, and it had not only masses had been gathered, it had been woven into a mat and then laid as the base for this road to go across the bog. And again, you just think, wow, that is so much work. It was used for the Romans had it for their headdress, and it was in their helmets. And in the National Museum of Scotland, there's a few bits that have been found when they were in a site. So there's a half a woven basket and a bit of material. Doormats have been woven each year in Finland up until the present from hair moss. Birch roots and branches are used for rope. Grass, straw, hay, meadow grass, flax, kelp, fir roots was used in Loch Alsh for making ropes to hold boats. I'm sure people just looked at materials and just experimented. Ropes are part of our life. Until relatively recently, we made them from local plants and materials around us. They connected people with plants, place, and season, helped bound a community, and linked people with the past. This kind of talk was partly inspired by the old ropes that I'd read about, and then getting in contact with Karen, because there was evidence, she showed it in her slide, of that little bit of rope that was found. So that rope is 3-ply, and there was a bit of rope from the caves in Lascaux, which is also plant material and also 3-ply. So the way you're making it is by the hand twisting. So you've got the 2, and then you make 3 lots of ropes, and then you put those ropes together. And when she mentioned the S and Z twist, that's to give you the counter lock. I'm kind of moving my hands and everything. The people who do weaving and stuff will understand about that, but there's a lot of information held in that. So if people can't read that, I'll read it out. A winter's night around the fire in the house of a storyteller somewhere, anywhere in the Highlands. The houseman is twisting twigs of heather into ropes to hold down thatch. A neighbour crofter is twisting quicken, rowan, rods into cords to tie cows, while another is plaiting bent grass into grasses to hold meal. So, as we mentioned earlier, this is part of a year-long research project, and we're really interested in hearing from you. So if anybody has any rope stories they'd like to share, or I'd be happy if you emailed me. The other thing I'd like to say is about thinking about how rope can hold a community together. And a good example of this, if you haven't seen it, is the rope bridge from Peru, where basically every year they have to remake this rope bridge, and it starts with little bits of grass that is then rolled into rope, and then the ropes are bound into fatter and fatter ropes, and the whole village has to take part. And it's really interesting. It's very interesting to see. So it's just thinking about other ways. Thank you very much. So I'll stop sharing my screen if I know how. Yep. Have I stopped sharing it? Can you see us now? Okay, yeah. Great. So we need to put the chat. Yeah. Question for Carolina. Do you use the leaf or the stem? Thank you. I actually use both, but the stem sometimes it's not great. It's the leaves that are the stronger bits. I'll just do a quick answer. Hopefully that's enough. Oh, okay. If the recording's available, I think we need to ask the Highland Archaeology Festival about that. I presume it will be. Oh, yes, they've answered. Thanks. Oh, I'm still sharing. How do I? There we go. Thank you. Do you want to take that one?
The difference, it's really the size, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, the fibers that I was talking about, the very old fibers, are probably smaller and finer than the ones Caroline was talking about, because Caroline's was very much related to materials, whereas the fibers that I'm talking about were woven into things like clothes and baskets, bags, and all sorts of things. So really, that's the only difference. Rope tends to be much bigger and stronger than string. That's all. But and yarn, I think yarn tends to be wool, doesn't it? Tend to be animal fiber rather than plant fiber. But it's a little bit vague. But basically, string and rope are just different sizes. Let's see, what would be a suitable fiber for a bowstring in a treeless cold climate? Oh, I can't, can we scroll down this?
Yeah. I don't know why it's not going up.
Well, so the material that was used that's found in Mesolithic contexts in Russia and places, if that's what you're meaning, the most common is the inner bark from the linden tree, the lime tree. And so, although it would be, it's quite complex to make that, I've no idea how that would work for a bowstring. That is material that was used in a cold climate. A treeless cold climate, you would probably get maybe sedges. Yep.
Yeah.
You would know that, wouldn't you?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yes. How do we go down here?
I don't know. I think it's...
Is that at the bottom now?
Well, that doesn't... That's not...
Here we are. Is there any processing of heather? Yes, you answer that one.
Okay. No, not well. A little bit. When you pull it at this time of year, you just bring it in and you take the bits of earth and moss and stuff off it. And I actually, with secateurs or just with my hands, break off the bushier bits. Because they just make the rope weak and get quite fat. But when I've looked at some of the old ropes, they haven't. Maybe some bits you would take off. Yeah, straight from the pulled plant. And that's one of the reasons I quite like materials you don't have to do too much preparation with.
I wonder if we can see the rest of that, because I didn't actually see that question properly. Beginnings of bow hunting at the end of the last ice age. All right. Okay. Well, it's much more complicated than that, really, because there's there were areas of fibers were used along, before the last ice age and during it, and the bow hunting, I think, was a little bit later than that, and so I think that there's not very much evidence at the moment of what the early bows were, so I'm not terribly sure, but I think that you would get rooty fibers from sedges. Is that correct? That you could probably, and sedges occurred right across the Mammoth steppe, right across the whole of Europe. So that's probably, yeah, they would be able to make fibers out of those. Can you please repeat the whole question before answering? Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry about that. So the questions was, is there the processing of heather? Is there more processing of heather? And what would be a suitable fibre for bowstring in a treeless cold climate? And what's the difference between string, rope, cordage and yarn? And then how do you harvest the fibre from under the bark of trees? Well, that's something, there is different ways that you do it. But I've not actually got much experience of that. I've used a little willow bark, but often the lime, it splits into layers. You can bash it with a wooden mallet and you can soak it. You soak it for a number, and then the fibers just peel apart.
Can I interrupt there?
Yeah.
There are some fantastic YouTube videos. So if you really want to go into look into detail about how you harvest and how you prepare the fiber from the inner bark, just type in different search words like, I don't know, bast fiber from lime trees, or bast how to make string from the bark of trees. And there are lots of really, really good YouTube videos that explain this in great detail. I don't think there are any more questions.
No, I don't think so.
Thank you. No more questions?
Well, thank you all very much. That's great.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's quite strange.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Bye then.